Hey everyone, Steven here, and welcome to my little library of horrors. So today's topic is going to be about love and horror. So love is no stranger to the genre of horror. I feel like horror takes love and really dissects it. It takes a look at the complications of it. It's probably the most complicated emotion that we as humans feel. It's hard to explain basically, but with horror I like that it's not always sunshine and rainbows. It goes into the more realistic aspect of it, the arguments, divorces and infidelity and things like that, and overcoming those obstacles. And more specifically in today's discussion is going to be the topic of forbidden love. Your Romeo and Juliet, if you will. So today's book review is going to be Let the Right One In by, and I apologize, this review is going to be full of mispronunciations because it is written by a Swedish author and takes place in Sweden. So I apologize immensely for the absolute butchering I'm going to do of any names of locations or characters or anything. So I apologize. But Let the Right One In by John Avid Lindvist. Again, I am truly sorry. Like, that is just, I don't know. That's my own ignorance, so I apologize. So, does Let the Right One In give us the tale of a sort of horror-filled Romeo and Juliet? Not really. But before we get into that, I would really appreciate it if you just dropped a quick like on the video. It helps spread awareness in the algorithm and just gets, the video out there. But I really appreciate it. Anyway, with Let the Right One In, it starts off with us being introduced to our protagonist, 12-year-old Oskar. Oskar is your very typical bullied middle schooler. He gets picked on a lot in school. Funnily enough, he gets called Piggy, which instantly reminds me of Friend by Diana Henstell. So right off the bat, I was all like, oh, cool, that's pretty cool. So, yeah, so Oskar becomes obsessed with a murder that happens in the woods near the town that he lives. We actually get the perspective of the killer, who turns out to be a character named Hakan. So Oskar, like I said, becomes obsessed with the murder, and he has a scrapbook filled with, famous serial killers and cases that he's been obsessed with. So right off the bat, I can already kind of, vibe with Oskar. That was like a big thing I did in high school. I became obsessed with serial killers, so like I study them a lot and stuff like that. So, but anyway, as we transition from Oskar's point of view to Hakan's point of view, we sort of discovered that Hakan is a serial killer and is also a child predator. So with that, we then get introduced to our next main character, supporting character, who is named Lack, who is essentially like not a lone drunk in a sense. Like, he's a drunk, but he hangs out with other drunks at a Chinese restaurant, and he's seeing this woman who is another supporting character. Her name is Virginia. So, we start getting introduced to them. And then eventually we get introduced to Tommy, who is this 16-year-old troublemaker who lives in Oskar's apartment building. But he's nice to Oskar. He essentially is a kid that is your typical 16-year-old. He feels like he knows more than he does, wants to leave his small poor town, wants to escape, but, ultimately falls back on relying on crime and doing drugs and stuff. So, so anyway, Oskar gets, eventually meets Ellie, another little girl that lives in the apartment complex, who turns out to be a vampire. And Oskar and Ellie quickly develop a friendship. They have a lot of really, I shouldn't say a lot, they have a good beginning bonding relationship where, Oskar introduces Ellie to a Rubik's Cube, and, she kind of, they kind of bond over that. And eventually we learn that Ellie lives with Hakan. So they have this sort of symbiotic relationship where Ellie needs blood and Hakan provides that for her through killing people, where Hakan wants to do what he does because he is what he is. I have to be very broad in the description just so YouTube doesn't go crazy on me for it. So, but yeah, so that's kind of like sort of the cast of characters we get here. And that's sort of the first big issue I have with the story, is the characters are very two-dimensional and boring. Like, everyone's very flat. Every conversation between Oskar and Ellie is very awkward. And, at the beginning it should be, I understand, you know what I mean? It absolutely should be. Oscar's sort of just now kind of just coming into puberty, basically. He's starting to discover his sexuality, basically. He's starting to question himself. Not so much question himself, like he's discovering women, basically. But that sort of never changes throughout the story. It never seems like Oskar and Ellie ever really become super close in an organic way. Everything feels kind of rushed. Again, I understand, like, Oscar's 12, but Ellie's 200 years old. You know what I mean? So I guess you could give the argument that Ellie is still mentally 12 years old, but I have to disagree with that because she understands a lot more adult concepts. Which she should, again, being 200 years old, having observed human interactions and whatnot throughout that time, you would assume she would know more. So, yeah, so they just feel flat. Hakan's just an overall terrible character. You know what I mean? There's no... He tries to, like, kind of redeem himself by, like, donate, like, giving this kid caught in, like, a child trafficking ring money to go escape or whatever. But at the same time, it's like, he's still going back to do what he has to do for Ellie to do what he wants. So it's like, there's no sort of redemption. And that's the overall, like, that's the overall arc of every character in the book, almost. There's no... Everyone backpedals. There's no redemption for anyone. Like, we get this other character, Stefan, who is dating Tommy's mother. So, and he's a cop. He's a very religious cop. So, like, right off the bat, he gives, like, instant, just, like, not good feeling. Like, I instantly didn't like his character right away. He comes off as that character that's, very macho and very, my idea is what's best. I know my opinion is the right opinion no matter what. And like, I can't stomach people like that in real life. So it's like, it translates very well into books as well. I hate characters like that. But like, Stefan's character arc throughout the book is like him trying to kind of bond with Tommy and show him that he's not a bad guy. But then like near the end of the book, we get this scene between him and Tommy's mother where he literally turns around and is like, I'm trying really hard right now not to slap you. And I'm like, okay, so you are exactly what I thought you were. So there goes any likability I had for you out the window. And it's like, that's not even like the end of the story with his character. It further goes on with him trying to be this redeemable character. And I'm just like, I can't accept that. Like, that's not something I can look past. Like, you literally just told this woman who is essentially putting you above her own son that you want to smack her in the face. And it's just like, okay, dude, like, so you're a pig and a jerk. So, again, that's Hakan not redeemable, Stefan not redeemable. Let's see, Tommy's okay. Like, like I said, he doesn't change throughout the story though. Like, he doesn't really become worse or better by the end of it. Stefan and Tommy's side story kind of just fizzles out almost. You know what I mean? There's no resolution between them, their mother, anything. Like, it's like something happens, we get a vague description of what's happening with Tommy, and that's it. And it's just kind of like, okay. And again, same thing with Oskar. He goes from this bullied kid to he eventually stands up to Johnny and almost sort of becomes the school hero in a way, only for a scene to happen later where he literally goes back to square one and then again tries to come back and like be tough again. But then we have the climax at the end where it's just like I said, it's just this constant bouncing back and forth of going nowhere. It eventually evens out to nothing. So, yeah, so that's kind of like my complaint with the characters. Eventually in the middle of the story, we get a little bit of interest when Ellie attacks Virginia and transforms her into a vampire. Virginia's character is easily the most interesting story arc in the book. We get her dealing with realizing she's a vampire. It's wonderfully told. We get her this slow, like I said, it's a slow realization starting from her nausea from thinking about food to her sensitivity to sunlight. You know what I mean? It's not just like, boom, she instantly is like, oh my God, I'm a vampire. It's this slow, oh my God, like I know what's happened. And it's great. And it's very well detailed. And there's a lot of really like good scenes with her. The problem is that doesn't happen until page 300 out of a 472 page book. So I'm no stranger to slow burns. I like them, but this book is filled with filler. There is just so much filler in this book that doesn't need to be there. Like, we get this chapter where Oskar visits his father, and it's sort of supposed to build this feeling of isolation for Oskar and sympathy for Oskar, but we already get that near the beginning of the book, from the simple conversations he has with his mother about his father, and even like the one phone call we get from his dad at the very beginning, like sort of near the beginning of the book, we can already get a taste of his character. So it's like, we don't need that scene where Oskar goes to visit his dad. That literally just doesn't need to happen. It doesn't add anything to the story. Like, and the author kind of tries to like force it in where like there's a scene later on near the climax where Tommy's mother calls his father to kind of like, you know, yell at him for something that happened, and Oskar uses that instance to kind of sneak out past his mom, only to be caught midway of him sneaking out, and he runs out anyway. So again, that just completely eliminates the need for the whole scene in its entirety. It just didn't need to happen. You know, we also have even honestly, like, Hakan's character doesn't need to happen at all. Like, he's essentially, he's there to kind of like shoehorn an antagonist in there. And, you know, I guess that's what I should say instead of filler. A lot of the book feels shoehorned in. It definitely feels shoehorned where it doesn't need to be. So, a bit of a spoiler. There's a twist a little later on in the book where we discover that Ellie is actually Elias. He's a boy. So, you know, again, I don't have a problem with that. Like, it's not the idea of Elias being, you know, either gay, transgender, non-binary. Like, none of that is an issue for me. It's the fact that it feels shoehorned in. Like, we get no foreshadowing at all about that being a possible twist, or, you know, that even being this sort of thing that Elias wants to tell Oskar, but is afraid to. Like, it just never, it's just like, boom, here's this thing of sympathy I need for this character, so I'm gonna put this in here. And like I said, it's, and we have no inkling of, you know, Oskar being interested in boys at all if Elias is gay. Like I said, there's no inkling of Oskar having any sort of feeling towards the same sex or anything like that. So again, it just feels very shoehorned in. It's not the idea of it. It doesn't feel organic. And that's where, to me, it feels like I need sympathy for this character. So let me go ahead and just pick this out over here and like, okay, here's my sympathy point for this character. And I just don't like that. So, yeah, so as the story goes on, you know, the plot lines start to come together. Hakan eventually becomes a vampire as well. And, you know, starts to chase Elias to get what he's wanted this whole time. And we get this scene in a storage room with Elias and Hakan, you know, finally kind of like coming together. And it's just like, which should be this really intense scene of like, you know, the antagonist and like the other protagonist of the book, like finally coming face to face. It just comes off as like stupid. Like, the first thing Hakan does when he walks in the room, it just starts going to town on himself. And Elias starts laughing. And I start laughing because it's friggin' ridiculous. Like, why? And it's like, I understand it's supposed to like build up this tension of like a scene that's about to happen, but like, I'm literally just like laughing at this point because not only is Elias laughing, why should I feel any terror about what's going on? Like I said, this just feels ludicrous. Like, this guy is like apparently hung like a tree trunk, and like I said, it's just that's his first thing is like, look what I can do. And it's like, okay, sure, we're gonna go with that. So, like I said, it just ultimately kind of kills the scene. You know what I mean? Like, more stuff happens after that, but I can't take any of it seriously. It feels so shoehorned. I can't think of a better word, is shoehorned. Even when we finally get to the climax of the story, it's actually really good up until a certain point, and it's just like, boom, okay. What happened is now all up to you. You're implied. It's not an ambiguous ending, like you absolutely know what happens, but it's like, why do we get all this description of everything else in the story, but when it comes to the climax, we get half of it? It just feels so frustrating. It's, and it's like, especially the little sprinkles of detail we get, it's like, that could have been awesome, because the author does a really good job of describing really disturbing scenes when they need to happen. Like, there's this awesome scene where Oskar is like, I want to see what happens if you come in and I don't invite you in. And, again, it's only ruined because Elias is like, they feel awkward. They just feel a little awkward. That's the thing. Like, there could have been a really good tension build up for that scene, because the outcome was like, whoa, okay. Because it's always something I've wondered myself. You know what I mean? It's a wonderful sort of look into classic vampire lore. And I was just like, oh, that was awesome. That was great. And not only is it just like, okay, that happened. Now Elias is, and like, we're going to move on. It continues on. We see the side effects of that happening to Elias as well. And I'm like, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. That's great. And like I said, why did we not get that in the climax? There's another absolutely brilliant scene. Like, it's not even a scene, it's just a paragraph. It's page 427, halfway through the page. It's the italicized paragraph. Brilliant, gruesome detail. Fantastic. I would read it, but it's a massive spoiler I don't want to give away. But again, where is that the whole rest of the book? And it's like, with the climax, we even finally get a little bit of personality out of Elias, other than just nothing. And it's like, again, where has this been the whole time? It could have been so much better if the characters were more fleshed out. Even, it's even sort of hard to kind of be a little sympathetic for Elias, because he gives the argument that he needs to kill out of necessity. He needs to feed for blood, where Oskar would have killed out of revenge for being bullied. So it's like, it's supposed to be this really interesting, moral take on, vengeance and the taking of a life, necessity out of enjoyment. You know what I mean? Where do you draw the line of where it's okay to take someone's life? But Elias essentially kind of contradicts himself a few scenes later, where he's paying Tommy to feed off of him in a way that's not infecting him. Where in a scene earlier in the book, Elias kills this old woman by setting her house on fire after feeding her. Now, again, the argument could be brought up that he does that to hide his identity and the fact that there's a vampire around. But this old woman was messed up on morphine. And, it's clear that Elias has at least somewhat of that hypnotic trance power that vampires have, because he uses it on her in a way. So you know what I mean? He could have done the same thing he did with Tommy, where he takes a razor blade and cuts the inside of the elbow and feeds that way, where he's not infecting his prey. So it just kind of leads me to believe that, I don't know, maybe Elias did it out of enjoyment too. You know what I mean? So like I said, it's kind of hard to like any of the characters in the book, because they all do stuff to contradict themselves, and everything feels shoehorned in. So here's how I would have done the story if I were to write this story. And that's why I never try to be super harsh in my negative critiques of book, because it's like, I always tell myself, why don't you sit down and write it if you think you can do it any better? So me explaining the way I would have done it doesn't mean I would have done it better than the author. It's just, this is how I felt it would have been more interesting to me as a reader. So what I would have done is I would have had Oskar, be the bullied kid, but have him be bullied because there's rumors of him being gay, especially being at that age, that's a huge thing, of course. So that's the reason he gets bullied, is that there's rumors that he's gay. And, Oscar's kind of sort of questioning that maybe he is, you know what I mean? He's sort of coming, like I said, he's hitting puberty. So he starts to, try to discover himself, and maybe realizes, maybe I do have feelings of interest for the same sex. And, but it gets to the point where, so the bullying gets bad. And then that's when Oskar meets Ellie. So, so then when Oskar and Ellie start to bond, we need more bonding experiences. So they start to bond. So Oskar is now, when he starts to garner feelings for Ellie, he thinks, well, maybe I'm not gay after all. I'm starting to have feelings for this girl, and da-da-da. And then, when Ellie reveals that she's a vampire, that's when they can sort of start their, sort of forbidden love, where, we have Ellie who needs blood to survive. Oskar could, and then Oskar sort of like snaps and like kills a bully. So now we have, like I said, the start of this forbidden love / symbiotic relationship, where Oskar can start providing blood for Ellie, and Ellie can live, and they, start to fall in love. And you could have, even before they meet, that could even happen before they meet, or that's how they meet. We could have our first sort of pre-introduction to Ellie of her attacking Virginia, and that's how we start, that's how we can get Lack into the story. And, still have their arc where, Lack is in love with Virginia, but he hates himself and doesn't feel like he's capable of loving someone, or is worthy of love. So when, we get that sort of side story going on, we can then have a full introduction to Ellie where she witnesses Oskar killing Johnny. And, she then feeds off of Johnny's body. Or, can feed off Johnny's body while Oscar's killing him. So you know what I mean? And that's how their relationship can start. So now Oskar can go after the other bullies that's bullying him while Ellie is able to survive. And that's when, you know what I mean, we can have Tommy as Oskar, still the older kid that looks over Oskar from the bullies, and gives him life advice. We can then have Stefan's character, get rid of the religious aspect. We can even keep the religious aspect, just don't have it be his whole personality, and don't have him be a jerk. You know what I mean? We can have him try to be that person who wants to build a relationship with Tommy to guide him to a better path, and also have him be sort of the lead officer on this sudden serial killer case that's happening in the area. So then we can start to add in as Oskar and Ellie start to bond, we need to start planting some seeds that Elias wants to tell Oskar that he's a boy. And then we have that big reveal. So that way it's not just such a sudden shock to the reader and doesn't feel like it's come out of nowhere. And then, like I said, that can further complicate Oscar's feelings of himself and the relationship with Elias at this point. With, on top of that, with all of Oscar's bullies now being murdered, Oskar doesn't want to kill anymore. He did it out of revenge for people that were hurting him and making him feel the way he felt. So now we have this complication of Ellie needing blood and Oskar starting to sort of wrestle with his moral ambiguity. So as that's happening, we could have, eventually we could kill off Virginia's character, which leads Lack to, discovering, who the killer is. Because the way he does it in the book, we could almost similarly do it within this story, where he recognizes Oskar instead of Hakan and figures out where he lives. And, and there's two ways you could eventually end the story. You could have Lack kill Elias, Oskar kills Lack out of grief, and then with Stefan sort of figuring out also who the serial killer is, having him kill Oskar in sort of like a, suicide by police kind of thing, Or what you could do is we could have Lack discover who Oskar is, go to where he lives. He could, attempt to kill Oskar, like mortally injure Oskar. Elias kills Lack, and then Lack turns Oskar into a vampire. And then you could either have, Stefan maybe leading the SWAT team to where Oskar lives, and having Elias and Oskar maybe just, as the sun comes up, embrace each other and open the blinds, doing that. Or, no, I think that's exactly how I would end it. That way, with either scenario, you still get your Romeo and Juliet tragic ending. You get your forbidden love. You get, your multiple tragedies. And you still get your romantic ending. But, that's genuinely what I would have done. But, overall, for Let the Right One In, I wasn't as harsh as I thought I was going to be. But honest thoughts. There's a lot that can be cut out. The characters are very two-dimensional. And it's just not very interesting. There's not a lot that happens. It feels like, again, the whole thing just feels very shoehorned overall. So, the best way I could describe it is it feels like all the working of a Stephen King book without that special King touch. And, that's not a knack. I shouldn't say a knack. That's not a knock to the author or his writing style or his ability. He's clearly very talented. I just personally didn't like the direction of the story and felt that the characters weren't relatable or likable in any way. And it just could have been handled a lot better. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 2.5 out of 5. I give it the 0.5 because the scenes where action does happen, where we get the really gruesome descriptions of certain things, it's brilliant. And I only wish that was spread out more through the story. But what do I end up taking out of it, the whole thing? Well, love who you love. Love's complicated, and life's complicated. At the end of the day, who someone decides to love and how they love them doesn't affect your life personally at the end. You can have your beliefs, you can have your ideas, but, at the end of the day, let people love who they love. It doesn't really hurt anybody, and life's hard enough. We can't control who we are attracted to and who makes us feel safe and comfortable and worthy, and we shouldn't judge who decides what makes them feel that way, because, somebody could be doing the same thing to us and we don't know it, but we shouldn't care either. So, yeah, love who you love, live and let live. But that's going to be it for me today, everyone. Sorry this turned out into a way longer review than I thought it was going to be, but if you managed to sit through it all, I really appreciate it. Drop a like on the video, subscribe for future reviews, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Until then, be nice to yourselves. Bye, everyone.